Welcome to today's webinar to release a brand new report on youth level outcomes and measures for system responses to youth homelessness. This project is a collaboration between Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago and Youth Collaboratory, but I would say I'm most excited about the release of this work because it is the result of hundreds of stakeholders within the field. I did go over a couple of logistics. If you have any, for those of you who just joined us, if you have any questions or trouble, you can type directly into the chat box and look for a response from one of our team. Also, if you want to download the slides from today's presentation, it's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a file box that says Download Files. Click on the name of that file, and then you will see a Download Files button show up from there. Before we move forward, let me introduce myself and our role in the project, and I'll have Matt introduce himself as well. My name is Megan Blondin. I'm the Executive Director here at Youth Collaboratory. Youth Collaboratory is representative of hundreds of members, more than 200 members that we serve annually, and beyond our membership, we provide a number of services and initiatives that are aimed at the broader field. So we reach about 12,000 stakeholders nationally, providing training and consulting to 3,000 of those stakeholders. We're really focused on advancing the youth services field, particularly in this line of preventing and ending youth homelessness, which is the result of where this work comes from. Matt, do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name is Matt Morton. I'm a researcher at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. I'm based in New York City myself, and my team and I lead a national research agenda focused on youth homelessness, and we really focus on trying to bring better evidence to action toward preventing and ending youth homelessness across the country and in partnership with specific communities wherever we can. Really excited about this release and this partnership, and thank you so much for joining.
And welcome to all of you who are introducing yourself in the chat box. Please feel free to continue to do that. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. We do have a large number of people joining today's release. And as a result of that, all of your phone lines are being muted. So if you have any questions or technology issues, you could type that directly into the chat box. I also want to say as we move through the presentation, you don't have to wait for us to pause to ask your question. Feel free to answer it or put it directly in the chat box, and we'll pause occasionally to go back and capture those. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to open today's webinar by really celebrating the initial response that we have had in releasing this report. I'll talk a little bit about it in the background, but we were really pleased to see as we began to roll out where there was agreement in the field, just how much agreement there was across so many stakeholders that were involved in identifying these. That includes key federal departments, so there were 6 federal departments that were involved in this work, along with stakeholders such as providers and young people, particularly also the federal departments that are primarily focused on homelessness, so Housing and Urban Development, as well as the Family and Youth Services Bureau under Health and Human Services. I think we want to point out that this is the first step. It's a big step, but it's really only the beginning. So we'll share these findings, but then we'll talk about where this is going to go next. And I would be remiss if before we started that I didn't thank our 2 funders, both the Melville Foundation and the Rakes Foundation, both of whom stepped up and provided the funding to support the work that promoted consensus across the field. So let's begin by briefly sharing some of the background on where this work came from. in 2011, I imagine that this framework looks fairly familiar to a number of you. In 2011, the U.S. Interagency Council for Homelessness pulled together a number of federal departments in consultation with national organizations to develop this systematic framework for ending youth homelessness. And for the first time, this is where we see 4 core outcome areas identified. Those 4 core outcome areas are stable housing, permanent connections, education or employment, and social emotional well-being. So what this did for the field is that it underscored preventing and ending homelessness is not just about stable housing, but also includes these 3 other outcome areas: permanent connections, education or employment, and social emotional well-being. So great, we have these 4 core outcome areas identified, but there remained a large challenge in the field, and that was that there was no common and reliable, valid measures. As a membership organization ourselves, providing training and consulting to 3,000 stakeholders in the field annually, I can't tell you the number of requests that we received on a regular monthly basis asking for common, reliable, and valid measures across the 4 core outcome areas. And I imagine that much of that is because without these, it's difficult to assess a young person's needs, match them to services that specifically target those needs, and also as a program or a system, having the ability to monitor progress over time. This was complicated by the fact that there was a lack of guidance and consensus on outcomes and outcome measurement at the program level. So which outcomes and which measures. It was kind of like the Wild West, everyone doing their own thing, and that really made it difficult to build on each other's work, and it also ultimately hindered the possibility of system-level planning and action that is specifically focused on targeting those outcomes, which we know have a strong evidence base to preventing and ending youth homelessness. So that is really the challenge that came to us, and in partnership with Matt and his team at Chapin Hall. And so from there, that is where this project was born out. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about our approach to solving that challenge?
Sure, thanks, Megan. So it's a big challenge, and one of the key points I just want to reinforce is that we recognize that while, as Megan says, the status has sort of been the Wild West in terms of using different types of outcomes and measures. There really has been very little consistency and agreement on what outcomes and measures to use. Some are made up, some are validated, and even when folks are using validated instruments, often they're very different, so it makes it difficult to compare. And what that means for a research approach is that while there's a lot of diversity out there in what people are doing in outcomes measurement, we're not starting from scratch. And so our research approach wasn't about developing and validating new instruments and tools. This isn't one of those kinds of exercises for measurement, though there are good ways to do that in the future to help plug gaps or to refine instruments that already exist. But because we are not starting from scratch, we really wanted to be able to better understand what outcomes and measures are already out there that are used in the space or in related spaces around vulnerable youth. What do we know from the evidence about those measures? What do we know about people's experiences with using those measures? And then from that information, along with a significant amount of input from youth with lived experience of homelessness, service providers, and others, selecting a set of outcomes and measures that can be used as core measures for the field. So the research approach was really designed to do just that. It included 3 major components. One component is a background review and appraisal of measures that already exist. So when we talk about a background review, we include multiple sources. One source is the most systematic and comprehensive evidence review of programs and interventions for youth experiencing homelessness to date. This was conducted as part of Voices of Youth Count, a national research initiative led by Chapin Hall. It serves a bigger purpose to provide better evidence on the programs that are out there and to summarize the evidence of what we know around different types of programs for youth experiencing homelessness or for prevention. We'll be publishing the broader review later in the summer and in early fall and sharing a lot more. But in the meantime, what we also got was all of the measures that evaluations had used to document success or progress against a range of programs that are out there. So altogether, we included, I think, 61 impact studies of different types of interventions for youth homelessness, and we gathered all of the outcomes and measures that were used in those studies and appraised those measures. We also documented the measures that are used in a range of proposals for HHS Family Youth Services Bureau proposals for the Maine Runaway and Homeless Youth programs. And given that there are other types of programs that aren't funded by FISB that are also serving youth experiencing homelessness, like rapid rehousing or host homes, we also reached out to a range of service providers that are implementing those types of programs to get a sense of what types of outcomes they're documenting and what measures they're using to do it. Once we had gathered all of the measures and the evidence from those sources of the review, we then went into a stage of consultations. We conducted 16 focus groups remotely across the country. They included youth with lived experience. They included continuums of care and data leads for those systems. We included service providers working with youth experiencing homelessness. We included federal partners and officers and some state government officers, as well as some folks in philanthropy. So we really tried to get a diverse range of perspectives to help us better prioritize and form some consensus around which outcomes are likely to be most important and what are the best ways to measure them and considerations that we should take into account in selecting the measures. Taking all that information into account, we consolidated it all, we wrote up a draft report, and then we got a lot of good feedback from a steering committee behind this project, which includes a range of youth with lived experience, service providers, leaders in the field, advocacy organizations, and some federal representatives. And we also got guidance through individual consultations with key federal partner agencies. Ultimately, when we were looking at prioritizing the measures, these were the main categories of information we were trying to document and take into consideration. No one measure is going to be perfect for the field. And ultimately, we also recognize that lots of organizations already have measures they use that they really like, and they're going to want to maybe add others or want supplementary information. Maybe a particular provider is going really deep into permanent connections and they want to capture more information there. That's great. What we're really trying to propose is a minimum core set of outcomes and measures that could be used more consistently within communities, across organizations, and across communities so that we can learn together, grow together as a field, and make a better policy case around where we need more and better investments as well. And the factors that we took into consideration included first, just making sure that an outcome and a measure aligned with one of the USICH core outcome areas. Some folks might care a lot about something like physical health, for example. That's very, very important and something that should be paid attention to in terms of outcomes measurement. But we had to limit the scope of the exercise, so we really focused on the 4 core outcome areas of the USICH framework. We also looked at relevance, to what extent did the evidence support that a particular outcome was related to preventing or addressing youth homelessness. So we paid attention to that empirical support around it, as well as folks' feedback around the relevance of different outcomes. We looked at measurability. So it really needed clear guidance. It needed clear tools and documentation about how to measure it. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for you all to use at scale. We looked at validity and reliability. These are the what researchers would call psychometrics of behind an instrument. And validity means to what extent does research suggest that the measure captures what it proposes it captures. And reliability means, you know, if you ask this measure over time, would it be consistent? Or if you asked it before or after lunch, you know, would you get a comparable answer? Or if I ask the question or Megan asks the question or administer the measure, will we get similar information? So reliability really looks at that type of information, because without that, it's hard to take a lot of credence in the information that you get. And then finally, it's feasibility, which is really important when we're thinking about scale. And for feasibility, we wanted to know that the measure was clear, it was brief, it was easily implementable across systems and services. And so measures that were, you know, 60 items, 70 items or more were automatically excluded. Sometimes we mention them as good potential measures for going further if you'd like to go deeper into specific areas in your service programs. But for core measures to be used consistently across the field, it was really important that the measures were feasible. The other part of this that was an inclusion-exclusion criteria was that the measure had to be available in the public domain and without a paywall. So there are some really good measures that are out there on social skills and everything else that you have to get special permission to use or that you have to pay a fee to use. We didn't include any of those because it would make it difficult to use it across communities and service providers. The outcomes and measures that we included started with stable housing. So what we're going to do is just give a little bit of information. I'll share those on stable housing, and I'm going to give a little bit of context as to what type of information that we considered, to give you a little bit of a flavor of how the outcomes and measures were selected. And then Megan will do the same for some of the other outcomes and measures. And there's a lot more detail in the report for those of you who are interested. So for stable housing, the consultations really raised these key challenges. One, that young people move around or stay in temporary arrangements under okay circumstances. So sometimes you can have a couch surfing arrangement that is acceptable, at least for a time period, and other times you don't, for example. And so young people kind of highlighted that you know, there is that measures need to take into account the circumstances of particular sleeping arrangements. Also, young people come in and out of homelessness. They come in and out of different sleeping arrangements. We heard this in our consultations. We learned this through Voices of Youth Count. So this elevates the importance of going beyond just a snapshot in time to capture a young person's situation and better understanding young people's housing and stability in the context of a high degree of fluidity, and looking at various types of living situations that young people can experience, and some of them may be being positive stepping stones, if not, you know, where you want them to end up. Ultimately, they can still be a positive outcome, at least in the short term. So given these insights, we identified two outcome measures as core measures and one as a going further measure, meaning, you know, for many service providers, this would be a good supplement, but we, for various reasons, sometimes because there wasn't enough information or it wasn't quite validated enough, we weren't quite ready to suggest it as a core measure. So for the two core measures, first we suggest basically continuing with an outcome measure that's already included in RIE HMIS. It is about one's expected destination when they exit a program. However, we have adapted it a little bit so that you could also ask it around intake for baseline information, so understanding where a young person has been staying, and then following that change, in where their destination is when they exit a program, and then being able to use the same kind of measure, say 3 months or 6 months after they leave a program, to be able to see whether there are positive changes in their current housing situation. However, as the consultations highlighted, looking only at a snapshot in time is very limited because young people come in and out of different housing situations, in and out of stability. So a young person might exit into something that appears to be stable, but if that doesn't last for 3 weeks or more, or a certain amount of time, then in fact it actually wasn't stable, even if it appeared to be upon exit. And so the consultations really suggested also including a measure that is short and brief and succinct around recent housing instability over a period of time. Because there wasn't a good one that was satisfactory and short enough, we developed one drawing from existing literature and the consultation input. It's a very short measure, includes just 4 items, but it looks at young person's housing instability according to a few different types of sleeping arrangements over a 30-day period. So that way you could ask it, 30 days or 6 months or 3 months after a young person exits a program, and it doesn't depend on where they're sleeping that night. You get a broader window of time with which to assess whether that young person is still struggling with housing instability or not. And then with that, being able to have a conversation around the support that might be had with that young person. And then third, the sort of gold standard in housing measurement or housing stability is a tool called, or an approach I should say, called the Residential Timeline Follow-Back Inventory. What this does is it's really more of an interview style, and it allows you to be able to capture information over time about the days within a defined period of time, like 6 months or 3 months, that a young person was stable or unstable, and you can get a whole lot of good nuanced information around the types of sleeping arrangements during that period of time. It's a very good measure, but there's not just one tool that's easily scalable right now for service providers and systems, and it takes a little bit more training and preparation to be able to administer. So that's one reason why we put it as going further rather than a core for right now, but we see strong potential in developing that type of approach for a core measure in the future. Megan's going to take permanent connections.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Permanent connections. Sorry, I was just redoing my paperwork. It's well documented, and many of you have experienced how important social isolation or a lack of positive connections can have an influence on homelessness. And at the same time, connection to at least one caring adult is known to have better outcomes related to well-being. This is one of the areas that we have seen the highest need in the number of organizations that were coming to us looking for measures that were appropriate for the type of services that they were providing. Some of the challenges that were identified in the stakeholders consultation is that the mere presence of a supportive person in someone's life offered very limited insight, and it was difficult to interpret. Also, it was common in programs that the presence of that supportive person was also being documented as a program staff or volunteer, which is not sustainable in the future for young people often. And when it came to consultations, particularly the youth stakeholders underscored the importance of capturing connections as more than one supportive relationship between a youth and one other person, pointing out that different people serve various purposes in their lives. And as a result, that brought us to the social connection scale from the Youth Thrive survey. And we came to this for a couple of reasons. One is that it measures how connected young people feel to both people and society. So it covers that range of attachments that consultation groups were looking for: attachments to family, communities, schools, other positive social networks, what various needs that a young person would, a permanent connection could be useful in their lives for. So different types and sources of support. The second is, although this measure includes the most items out of any other measure, it was relatively brief compared to the other measures that were out there. So it's 17 items. That is actually a fairly brief instrument for, or a measure for this outcome. And the third reason is that it was specifically validated for youth and young adults, that particularly youth of color and youth with similar demographics or characteristics to youth experiencing homelessness. Matt, I see a number of questions and activity in the chat box. Is there anything that we should pause and answer before moving on to education and employment?
So just to clarify a couple of points. One is that folks are asking if the instruments are available, and I just want to underscore that all of these measures that we're discussing today are freely available on the Youth Outcomes Project website, which you can find through the homepage of youthcollaboratory.org, and I've just included links in the chat box. There was also a question about whether returns to homelessness could be captured using the stable housing measures. One of the things that we've done, either by selecting or adapting existing measures, was refine them so that you could repeat the same exact measure over time. So these aren't just program exit measures. These are measures that you can include at intake to get baseline information on how a youth's doing when they come into a program to support service delivery, but also to establish that baseline. You could use them again at program exits, and then you could use them again in follow-up processes, maybe brief phone check-ins, maybe interviews later on, or surveys that are conducted online or through social media. But the measures are set up so that they could be repeated over time so that you could use them to capture trends and outcomes beyond program exits.
Thanks, Matt. And at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more around logistics, next steps on how to get there. Because like I said, it's just the beginning and not the end. Okay, let's move into education. This core outcome area typically lumps education and employment together, looking for high performance and completion of both educational and training activities, which lead to starting and maintaining adequate and stable employment. Some of the challenges that were identified here was determining the right stage of membership, of measurement. So that includes looking at enrollment as a stage, then attendance, and ultimately attainment of a diploma, GED, or certificate. So the challenge that many providers saw was at what point, at what stage, enrollment, attendance, or attainment should we be measuring. And the second challenge was framing up a measure broadly enough so that it is relevant for the educational pursuits and the range of young people. So range in terms of ages, we're looking at ages between 13 and 25, and then ranges in terms of the education that those age groups might be pursuing. So secondary education, vocational opportunities, and higher education. So there's measures that will look at pieces of those, but we wanted to find a measure that was broad enough to capture the full range. The stakeholder consultations also had a couple of insights. The first being that they rated and described attainment as the most important outcome for the education domain, right? Ultimately, that's what we're looking for. But there was a a piece related to both enrollment and attendance, particularly attendance, was described as an example of like a leading indicator, which reflects an early sign or difficulty that might be that you would want to include in a measure, particularly if you are doing assessment throughout a longer program like a transitional living program. So we landed on a couple of measures here. First, enrollment and attendance. So enrollment was recognized as an important first step, but it's difficult to just talk about enrollment without attendance. And so we were looking for a measure that would combine the two. And ultimately, there was no great measure that was as broad as we needed and included both of those pieces. So you'll see that that particular measure is one of our team-developed measures. And it's super short with just one item. Secondly, we included the educational attainment survey from the educational attainment component of the American Community Survey. So it is a slight adaptation, but it captures those range of educational attainments that we were looking for. And then for those who are looking to go further, as we discussed in the stakeholder group, low attendance or chronic absenteeism being a leading indicator. If you want to go further into that, we recommended the U.S. Department of Education chronic absenteeism measure. Matt, you want to take us into employment? Matt, if you're talking, you're muted.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I was
got it. All
right. So first, maybe I'll just address a question that Tracy raised about, how realistic is it to affect an outcome like attainment if we're only working with young people for, say, 21 days with a BCP or something along those lines? It's a really good question. And it reinforces a point we were making earlier, that these should be seen as core outcome measures, but not the end of outcome measures. So they're going to be very, you can think of almost endless program-specific outcomes. If you were to think of every single program that might be available to youth, well, that program will have specific parameters and it will have specific objectives. And so it makes a lot of sense to supplement a set of core outcome measures with program-specific indicators that help you track progress that's realistic for a program. But one of the difficulties we think with the field and really working towards ending youth homelessness is that we tend to think too much from a program lens. What can a program offer a youth rather than what does a youth need? And the whole point of having more common outcomes and measures across a set of core domains for youth experiencing homelessness is that whatever program or system a young person enters into, we're capturing some consistent information. And maybe the BCP doesn't have everything a young person needs to make a year of additional attainment or advancement in education, but a BCP then provides that entry point to help think about what will get a young person onto the path to making that progress and helping to link that young person with appropriate supports and services to get them there. So the idea of common youth outcomes and measures is that we're thinking more as a system and not just as a program. But that being said, it does make it makes a lot of sense to have program-specific indicators that are supplemental and with which you can track program-specific progress against. So going into the employment domain, one of the things that we gathered from the context is that high performance in and completion of educational and training activities and starting and maintaining adequate and stable employment is really important to get to sustainable housing over time, especially in the context of rapidly increasing housing costs along with largely stagnated income, especially for those who are in lower income brackets across the country. housing stability in the long term is just an unattainable prospect without a viable income and employment for many young people. So this came out as very important. And relatedly, a lot of young people in the consultation said it's not good enough to just have a job. In fact, a high percentage of youth already experiencing homelessness do have a job, but they tend to be sporadic, low-quality work, and without pathways into higher income. For some young people, they might be a good start, but that was something that young people expressed, was the need to collect more information on the nature of employment and income prospects. So young people actually elevated income over and above employment as a measure within, or employment status within this space. Another thing that we found just looking at the measures in the field is that we tend to use very simple questions like, do you have a job or not? And that runs against all of the international and national norms on how to collect good information about employment. And so there are actually brief measures that are used in major labor force surveys by the census and so on to capture employment and status information. And because we don't capture information in the same way, a lot of what we get back tends to be more biased, and it's difficult to compare to national trends or young people in broader data sets in the community or at the national level. So given that, we elevated income as a core outcome measure so that we can track progress in young people's income over time. HMIS data standards already has one, a measure for income, so if you're using that, you can stick with it for those young people. But if you're not using that measure, if you're not participating in HMIS, it's actually a pretty lengthy way to capture income information, and it's really not designed for you specifically. It includes a lot of other sources of income and a lot of granularity that applies to very few or young people in general. So what we did was we made it shorter, and we basically just included two categories. Income associated with what we would call earned income related to a job or self-employment, and then any other source. So it doesn't look at public assistance and all these other forms specifically. It just includes a catch-all category for all other sources of income and then earned income. So you can still compare it with HMIS data. You just don't get the same level of granularity, but it does have that comparability at the high level. So that's important. With employment status, again, it was important for us to use an employment status measure that wasn't, do you have a job or not? That means lots of different things to lots of different people, and it's not a very good way to capture employment information. So what we used was one of the most widely used employment measures in the country, which is with the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. We used a smaller set of items from that measure. The advantage is you get employment status related to both whether someone is employed or unemployed or out of the labor force or whether they're part-time employed. All of these have technical meanings that are a little bit different and important to capture. So this allows us to do that. And it also gives a little bit of information about the kind of sector or occupation in which a young person is employed. So you can track progress in those sources of information as well. The third measure that's here, it actually should be a core measure. I'm sorry, this is a mistake. But it's disconnected measure. And this actually isn't new information. It's not, you don't have to collect more information. It's a combination of the educational attendance and enrollment measure and the employment measure. It's an internationally used indicator. It's relatively straightforward to do once you have an employment status question and an education question. What it does is it shows whether a young person is what would be called disconnected, which means they're not in education, employment, or training, sometimes called NEET. And that's important for youth and young adults, we heard in the consultations, because sometimes it's seen as a knock on a program or a youth if a youth leaves employment, for example, to go into education or vice versa. And what we want to know here is whether a young person is just disconnected from all of the mainstream systems, which is a more instructive indicator for youth and young adults in particular. So that's an indicator that you can create from the measures that we've already proposed here. And we provide guidance on how to do that in the report. And then the last domain is on social emotional well-being. This is arguably the most challenging domain because it means so many different things. Within social emotional well-being, there are so many different types of outcomes that could be measured, ranging from self-esteem to mental health to depression to anxiety to social skills, aspirations, self-efficacy, and on and on and on. So this is a real challenging one, but we got a lot of really good insights. And one of those insights, was that this is really an outcome domain that needs to be captured multidimensionally. Because there are so many different aspects of social emotional well-being, it really wouldn't be sufficient to just look at one small sliver of what it means to have social emotional well-being in isolation. And then the second thing that we heard a lot from both youth and adult stakeholders was that there should be a bias towards strengths-based outcomes here. Here and in the permanent connections outcome, there's a real opportunity to document the assets that young people have and to foster and build on those assets in young people's lives. Here are the measures that we've proposed for use. The first is a mental health measure. And the nice thing about this mental health measure, it's a 14-item scale, and it includes 3 different subscales or domains of mental health: psychological well-being, social well-being, and emotional well-being. So you get some different dimensions here that can be tracked and captured. The other nice thing about this one is it's a strengths-based orientation to mental health. It takes the belief that just like physical health is not just the absence of physical illness, mental health is not just the absence of mental illness. And so the measures are fairly strengths-based and assets-oriented, and developed and validated widely with youth, including diverse groups of young people across different racial and ethnic groups. The second measure that we include as a core measure is the Youth Resilience Measure from the Youth Thrive Survey. And Megan mentioned another Youth Thrive measure that we've proposed for the permanent connections on social connections. So some of you might have seen that just over the last several months, the Center for the Study of Social Policy has released this Youth Thrive measure, which includes it's an instrument that takes about 8 to 10 minutes for a youth to complete, so it's not that long. It's available online. It's free, easy to access, and it actually includes 5 different measures: youth resilience, which is the one here; social connections, which is the one Megan mentioned. It includes knowledge of adolescent development, concrete support in times of need, and a 5th is cognitive and social emotional competence. So at a minimum, we suggested for social emotional well-being using the youth resilience one. It's very short. It's very much in line with empowerment theory and self-efficacy. And we like these measures in part because they took existing measures and revalidated and refined them with youth of color, primarily LGBTQ young people, and youth accessing services like the ones that we administer in our field. But in addition to those core measures, we also did include one brief measure for psychological distress. So this is the not so strengths-based measure. But a lot of service providers and systems still need a brief screener to identify presenting symptoms for potential mental health problems like anxiety and depression for young people that are coming through. This measure, the Kessler-6, developed out of Harvard, is arguably the most well-validated and widely used mental health screener in the world, and used by the World Health Organization and many others. It's very brief, just 6 items. There's a 10-item version too. And so for those that want to capture that information and track progress with scores over time, that's available, and we provide that information. For broader thriving, you could include all 5 of the outcome measures in the Center for the Study of Social Policy's Youth Thrive instrument, not just the 2 that we've suggested. And again, it only takes about 8 to 10 minutes, so that's a way to go further and capture broader sources of thriving. And then for life skills, for those of you that want to go further, and I know a lot of providers are already using the Ansel-Casey Life Skills Assessment. Some of that covers social emotional well-being, and some of it doesn't. Some of it's more practical skills related to cooking or self-sufficiency or financial literacy, for example, it's quite long. It's 113 items, so it is longer, but there is a short version that's only 20 items. So we do include those as going further. They don't fit too neatly in social emotional well-being, but there is some overlap, and many service providers are already using that as a helpful resource, especially for those organizations that are delivering life skills curriculum. Just to kind of summarize, there are 10 core measures ranging from 1 to 17 items each. Altogether, this is a fairly brief instrument if you were to compile all of them and use all of them. That should get you a lot of information to use both for service planning and tracking progress and outcomes and informing better systems to meet youth outcomes over time. This should give you information on stable housing, but also all these other core outcomes that influence one's housing stability, recognizing that housing alone, while critical, is not enough to end youth homelessness. Social connections, social emotional well-being, education, employment are also critical to young people's pathways to sustained housing stability. And we provide an example instrument on the website for the full set of the measures if you'd like to use that. But you could also just pull off the individual measures if you'd like to take them, one at a time or start to integrate them in a more staged way into your programming in your systems. The other thing I'll just note here is that at this point, Megan will talk more about the kind of next steps for this process, but this is a first big step, and what we really wanted to do was provide the field with, based on the best that we could do right now, the best information we have available to us, put out a set of outcomes and measures that we recommend for the field. And you could administer those in different ways. You might administer them through interviews or intake assessments or follow-up assessments. You could have young people self-administer them through online surveys or tablets or paper pencil. We're not prescribing how these measures are administered and integrated into your data systems at this stage. It's really about being a resource and providing these measures as a resource to the field. We've seen similar steps with after-school programs providing compendiums of measures, and that's been a really important step. And Megan will talk more about how we're going to work towards better processes and guidance around administration of measures and data integration. Megan,
Matt, do you want to pause and answer a couple of questions before we go into considerations?
Sure, absolutely.
So I'm going to do these little backwards, first doing Tracy's question and then moving into Eric's. So Tracy had the question of, do we have any suggestions for tracking youth after exit to administer post-exit measures? Pointing out the challenge in keeping track of young people.
This was something that came up a lot in the consultations and the conversations that we had. There's no easy way to do this. It's clearly difficult to follow up with young people, and unfortunately, when we're following up, we're more likely to follow up with young people who are doing best in the programs and are staying more stable and more connected to service providers. So sometimes even in the follow-up, we run the risk of getting biased information. It might look like overall youth are doing better after the programs or systems than they really are, because we're not getting outcomes information on some of the youth that are having the hardest time and are most unstable and hardest to reach. So there was a lot of discussion around that. Folks clearly felt, both youth and older adult stakeholders in the consultations clearly felt that doing a lot more work around follow-up assessments is important. That information is critical to know if we're actually helping young people achieve stable housing, and if we're not, what we could do better. And we could also look at the outcomes trends along those lines, like if we're seeing that youth who are lacking permanent connections, for example, are those most struggling to keep stable housing. That's really insightful for field and for practice. and looking at equity across race and ethnicity and sexual orientation, gender, and identity is really important to understanding whether exits are, equitable and systems are equitably exiting young people from homelessness. So there were some suggestions about how to do that from the consultations. They included more funding and investment for follow-up and aftercare services so that those follow-up assessments could be conducted in the context of those. Many researchers that do a lot of follow-up with young people over time in unstable situations involve a lot of staff, or peers in continuing to keep tabs, even if in a light way, with young people over time, and sometimes incentives like gift cards for completing a brief survey or conducting a brief interview every 3 months or every 6 months after an exit were all examples that came up. We talk about these a little bit more in the report, and I guess just to conclude, there's not just one way to do this. It's probably one of the toughest nuts to crack, is to get that good follow-up information. We see some ways where we can experiment as a field, but we really look to you all to share back with us, what's working and what's harder to be able to do that follow-up effectively.
Great, thanks, Matt. And then Eric had a question that I wanted to address in case other people were feeling this block. He asked the question, do we understand the adoption path or any potential commitments from funders, like the feds, state funders, local funders, philanthropy, for them to adopt these measures as requirements tied to their grant funding? And for the places where there are changes or refinements needed in data standards, any sense of the path for potential adoption of these changes? And I would say, Eric, this was definitely one of the things that we thought about when we were first pulling together the team for this work, because who cares if you have recommended measures if all of the funders were continued to be playing in the Wild West, essentially, right? If there wasn't promotion of this consensus. And like I said earlier in the call when setting that context, we were actually quite pleased to see the level of agreement that happened across these funders. And so if you look at the steering committee, you'll see a number of leading federal, state, and private funders from the youth homelessness field represented on that steering committee who helped to refine these recommendations. And I can't tell you exactly what each of them will do, but I can say, or when that will occur. What I can say is that, first, we've heard a fair bit of positive feedback for having done the research, the legwork on the background, the research, and the consensus promotion, both within and across these funders, to support their future changes or refinements to data standards. These changes, particularly for federal, state, and local funders, those changes typically already have scheduled update periods. So you may see some changes happening more quickly or slowly than others, and that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that update periods vary for some of those funders. Also, I would say, in the meantime, Youth Collaboratory and Chapin Hall are providing support for YHGP grantees under HUD and Basic Center, Transitional Living, and Street Outreach grantees under FISB on how they can integrate these measures into existing funding requirements, performance standards, corresponding measures where they exist. So I can talk about where to find those as we move into the, when we get to the end on next steps. Matt, you want to roll into considerations?
Sure, and also just to note, we had Melville Charitable Trust and Rakes Foundation were not only funders, but also are members of Funders Together to End Homelessness, and we're members of our steering committee, and have been partners in helping to communicate this out to other funders. And so we also see this as a two-way street. I think as you all are, funders can encourage folks towards using these common outcome measures, but I think funders, both public and private, are also often responsive to the field. So the more they're seeing you all using common outcomes and measures, I think the more we'll see funders change behavior as well.
Mm-hmm.
So considerations for measure and tracking. Some of these issues have come up, but we thought they were important enough to underscore. So we presented to you a set of outcomes and measures. And I know I've used these terms a lot. Remember, an outcome is a concept that's measurable that you're trying to capture and show change against over time in people's lives. A measure is a way to do that. It's your instrument, it's your tool. So you can measure something like self-esteem with 3 different measures. The self-esteem being the outcome, and then the Rosenberg scale, for example, an example of a measure. And so what we're really looking at is helping folks to consider some key issues as they take these into practice. First is examining outcomes with an equity lens. This is something that takes 2 broad approaches. One is selecting and adapting measures so that they're culturally appropriate for different racial, ethnic, and other subpopulations. We did our best to appraise measures based on not only validity and reliability, but realizing that validity evidence comes from context. So if a measure was validated with a bunch of largely white, upper middle income college students, then it might not be valid for the youth that we serve, who are disproportionately youth of color, LGBTQ, and from lower income backgrounds. So it's important to take that equity into account in selecting measures. Again, we did our best, but with many measures, even well-validated ones, there's limited information. So as a field, that's something I think we should be working on over time, paying attention to the extent to which these measures are culturally appropriate, and where they're not is it culturally appropriate or translatable as we want them to be, refining measures and better testing them with more diverse populations like those that we serve. And then the other part of this that we can do immediately is use this outcomes information and disaggregate results by racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, gender, subpopulations, so that we understand which subpopulations are making better or less progress against which types of outcomes, and what that means for how we might calibrate our systems around equity. It should give really rich insight into that. Second, there's no one right way to administer an outcome measure. You might administer an outcome measure face-to-face through a case work session or intake session. You might allow a young person to self-administer on a tablet or a computer and through a survey format. Some young people prefer one, some young people prefer the other. It kind of depends on the context. In the future, we're going to try to provide more guidance and examples of when those different choices might be appropriate. But either way, there should be careful thoughtfulness and training around whichever approach is used to administer the outcomes. You can have the most valid measure in the world, and if it's not administered in a valid way, then the information that you get will not be valid. So it's very important to remember. You can have a great measure on social emotional well-being, and if a young person is asked the questions in a demeaning way or in an unsafe space, then they probably won't answer that measure honestly or as candidly as they would otherwise. So it's really important to think about how and why you're choosing the administration approach that you are, and making sure that staff are ready to support that particular approach in a good way. Third is looking at these outcomes holistically. So don't look at these in isolation. Really think about what your data says about how long-term stable housing connects to positive connections or social-emotional well-being. And over time, looking at these outcomes together will give a fuller picture to better support an individual youth in service delivery and those casework conversations. But it will also help us at a system level better understand which of these outcomes are particularly important and under what situations. So just to give one example, there's one study done by Natasha Sleznik which showed that young people who had increased self-efficacy, in other words, greater confidence in themselves and their ability to overcome challenges, ended up having greater service connections and were more likely to remain stably housed. So that suggests self-efficacy could be an important target for intervention, which is in line with the youth resilience measure that we've included in this set of outcomes. So thinking about how these outcomes to connect and looking at your data with that lens, I think will be really important for all of us. Fourth is to pilot, learn, and evolve outcomes measurement for all of us working together. This is not a static representation. I can imagine that we would update this list of outcomes and measures every year or 2 years because the field changes. Youth Thrive, for example, just showed up 3 months ago as an instrument that we can rely on, and who knows what's going to be available in a couple of years. So think of this as a living list of outcomes and measures that we can update over time as we work together to improve our measures for our purposes. Then frame the purpose of outcomes measurement carefully. That means don't think about outcomes measurement solely as serving the purpose of accountability. It's not just whether your program is good or bad or doing a good job or a bad job. It's about how we're learning. What are we learning from this information for a youth individual care and support? And what are we learning from this outcomes information to make better program designs and better systems that work together across services? That should be the key intention of funders and of communities in participating in using these outcome measures, is that we all get better at this and don't just use these in very simple ways. So last is the follow-up issue that Tracy had recognized before. Follow-up outcomes measurement is very hard, but likely to be most successful in the context of continuous contact and support. We heard that a lot from consultations and among the service providers or the researchers that were doing a lot to follow up with unstably housed youth over time to capture information on their outcomes. These were key ingredients. They found ways to keep that contact and support going, even if in light ways, and that was really important. And of course, that has funding implications as well, but it's also about practice implications, how organizations and systems are prioritizing and setting up those follow-up processes so that we can capture that information over time. Megan?
Yes. Sorry, I was answering one more question. So let's move into our next steps. I see that there are a couple of questions, and I'm going to move through the next steps and then circle back to the questions in the chat box. So if you found yourself coming up with questions as we've been moving through that you haven't asked yet, feel free to throw those into the chat box. So as we mentioned, we see this as the beginning, not the end. And here we've outlined what the next steps or what the path forward is, how we see it moving next. Eric had asked a question about what the adoption path is, and this is an even bigger, broader path than that, how we see outcomes and outcome measures evolving. So moving forward, with the input from organizations and communities, we plan to develop operational guidance or protocols that would both guide the integration of these measures into practice, so tools and support for integrating them into specific programs, and also guidance on how to integrate into common data systems that are used by those organizations. So first step is to support the development of or provide operational guidance that supports integration. We're also looking to pilot and assess integration of these measures into organizations' routine programming and system efforts. So if your organization plans to integrate these measures and you're interested in the how to do that, I would suggest registering for our next webinar, which I'll discuss in a second here, and Alex can put the registration link to our next webinar. So this webinar was just like, here are the outcomes and outcome measures, here's the results of the work, and the next webinar is about application and implications of that. We also intend to develop or refine measures over time for the population and to maximize cultural validity for different subpopulations, so youth of color, youth for whom English is a second language, and LGBTQ youth. And then finally, we also intend to aggregate and analyze outcome data across communities to better understand or refine what the normative score levels would be, or identify where there's meaningful thresholds to inform service and support needs. So ultimately, this work takes us one big step further towards collecting and tracking better data on youth outcomes to guide service delivery. And these next steps will catapult us as a movement even further. So this is forecasting moving forward. Okay, so here's the information on the webinar. I want to point out that you can click directly on the screen in front of you, and it will pop open a screen. And so it won't take you out of the webinar. You can still listen to questions, but as I said, this is the time that we'll be talking about implications and applications. And then let's move into, before we move into questions, I just wanted to pull up, for those of you who haven't pulled up the report yet, let me share this pod here. Erin had asked the question, Matt, about how, if an organization adopted all of these measures, how long would the full assessment take? And I'll let you answer the question about time if you have an answer for that, but I wanted to point out for people, so if you go to the website, you'll see the chart. You can click on the individual measures. You can literally pick those up and put them into any screening or assessment packet that you currently use. And then we also included at the very end of that an example tool that includes all of the measures together for you. And so this is what the overview of that looks like. We say 57 plus items because there's one item that could be more or less, and we provide some guidance and information that is good to know there. It's also set out in an interview way versus a self-report way, but could easily be translated from interview to self-report. So I think for those of you who are might be interested in that, make sure that you look at the full example tool. And Matt, do you have any thoughts about Erin's question in terms of time?
Yeah, so it really depends a lot on the respondent and the process. So response times and surveys and interviews can vary quite a lot. But I would think it'd be close to about 20 minutes for just the core measures. Obviously more if you add a number that go in further measures. But all the core measures, the longest one is 17 items, and they're pretty simple to respond to for most of them, and especially if you are doing them through interviews and your interviewer or caseworker is familiar with, for example, the housing situation response options, then, as they have that familiarity and more practice with this, they'll be able to move through it quite quickly and know where to, check when a young person responds to where they're staying, for example, if there are a lot of response options. But I would say that the overall instrument would probably be administered in about 20 minutes on average with a young person. And the other thing I think this made me think of to highlight is it may be tempting to drop a question here or there, an item here or there, or to modify those. But for most of these measures, they are measures that are validated, and while they're available in the public domain, generally measures that are created and validated are provided to the public with the assumption that they will be retained as they are. So if you plan to make changes or adaptations to those measures, we'd suggest that you reach out to us or directly to the developers of those measures. We provide all of the source information. It's usually good practice to do that to make sure any adaptations you're making don't compromise the underlying integrity of a particular measure. So just something to keep in mind. It'd be more like it's usually a better idea to just decide which of the measures you want to use rather than to make ad hoc modifications, unless those modifications are reviewed or go through a good process to do that. Yeah, I guess we'll take more questions.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to, this was actually the resource that I was looking for to show you exactly what the example instrument looks like. So it shows you where to put in informed consent, where to include more background questions, and it includes prompts if you're connecting this at intake or baseline, if you're connecting it at program exit, some ways that you would want to ask the question. So moving that out, there was also a question that Alexia asked about how would you recommend COC head agencies specifically go about integrating these outcomes and measures? Should we just start with attending the webinar, the next webinar as well? I answer that as yes, the next webinar will talk more about application and implications for programs, organizations, and systems level work. And Matt, maybe I'll let you take this question from Jacqueline. Do you have any suggestions for modifying the Youth Connection Scale, which was developed for youth aging out of foster care to be used with youth facing homelessness? YCS is recommended as a going further resource.
So I think that any suggestions would be specific to particular items, and Jacqueline, thanks for that question. We could go through it. It is one of the reasons we actually put that as a going further measure rather than a core measure for two reasons. One, it was developed for that specific population, and the other because it's quite lengthy. So it's good for getting a lot of richness and detail. That being said, many of the items I think apply to youth in transition in general. So they're used for youth transitioning out of foster care, but many, as I read them, I would say are more broadly applicable to youth that are not necessarily coming out of foster care, but there might be some items or some framing that could do with some adaptation. And it's best to reach out to the instrument developers if you'd like to be able to do that and start a conversation with them. They may have already started even a process like that or had conversations with others about broadening the scope. But the core measure, the social connections measure that we've suggested in this domain is more broadly applicable. It's not specific to youth in foster care. What recommendations do you have for measuring, this is Nicole's question, what recommendations do you have for measuring outcomes in drop-in center, where some youth may have been coming for years and others might only come once or twice? I think it's a great question. I think it sort of is at this point something for a drop-in center to think about. I've met with a number of youth drop-in centers that perhaps not in the first hour of meeting a youth, but in a follow-up assessment, do a pretty thorough assessment to understand where that young person's needs and strengths are, and how best to plug them in with different services in considering their outcomes. And so I think this could be, these measures could fit into that type of process quite well, and could be used across drop-in centers that are playing that key front door role, but often wouldn't be appropriate, necessarily to collect that kind of information in, the first time of meeting a young person. Sometimes you just need, quicker crisis-oriented information to know best how to resolve that youth situation in the moment, or where that referral might go for a better intake assessment that includes broader outcomes information. So it's probably a little bit specific to what your local implementation arrangement is. But I would think about whether it's the drop-in center or somewhere in the system where you could capture information over time, and who would be responsible for that. And I know often systems aren't well designed for that, so it might take some thoughtfulness on the community's part that goes beyond just one specific program. But that can really make a difference. A lot of times we don't think about outcomes measurement itself as an intervention, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Larry Bickman out of Vanderbilt did a really interesting randomized trial with clinicians working with youth with mental health difficulties. And one group of clinicians captured regular outcomes information on the youth that were in their care and got biweekly feedback information about that youth's outcomes. And another group of clinicians just went through standard practice of supporting without that routine outcomes measurement information and feedback loop. And just being with the clinicians who had collected regular outcomes information and gotten those feedback loops led to better mental health outcomes among youth with those clinicians. So, and that's not even thinking about the specific services or evidence-based practices they might have been aligned with or not, but just the intervention of regularly capturing outcomes information and adjusting service for those young people based on their outcomes improved mental health in the end. And I think there's a real opportunity for organizations and systems to use this set of measures to achieve that kind of gain.
Thanks for that, Matt. Any other questions before we sign off here today? You're welcome, Nicole. I know a number of you probably have some burning questions around application and implications. Looking forward to the webinar, the next webinar happening in a couple of weeks. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to say if you ever want to return back to this webinar, it was recorded, and we are going to post it to our website. I definitely don't want to end before saying thank you to our research team, our federal partners, all of our steering committee members, and the consultation group participants, and most importantly, you all who are the providers who both pushed us to move this along and play that facilitative role across the multiple stakeholders,